modern people take it for granted that law and law enforcement is an essential government function. And I'm going to be arguing that that is not true. It is not true historically, that I'm going to be discussing the past of private law, what I call feud law, which is all right, this is just stopped showing what I'm displaying on here. It's showing the camera instead of my screen.
Okay. That one, it's not going to show what's on your screen. You're going to just look at this, but we'll be able to see it.
Huh?
We'll be able to see it, even if you're not seeing it there.
Past, present, and future. And I want to start with feud law. I will then go on to discuss elements of private enforcement of law that exist in modern societies or could exist in the near future in modern societies. And then finally, the institutions that I have imagined, which I eventually discovered are really a modern version of institutions that have existed in the past, for how you could have an entirely stateless society in the future. But let me start with the past, because that's the thing I learned about most recently. I concluded by the time I had finished my most recent book that when I wrote my first book 50 years ago, I was reinventing the wheel. That is to say, I was trying to imagine how a society in which law was privately enforced could work. And there were, in fact, real world examples in the past of societies that worked that way. And the basic logic of what I call feud law is that if you wrong me, I will harm you unless you compensate me. And in order for that to be a workable system, it's got to solve 4 different problems. The first problem is some way of making sure that I can only force you to compensate me if you really have harmed me. In other words, to make sure that it's law enforcement and not extortion. And I think of that as some mechanism such that right makes might. So it's practical to threaten you if you have harmed me, but it's not practical to threaten you if you haven't. The second thing I need is a commitment mechanism. Some way of making sure that when I say, you've harmed me, I'll get you if you don't pay me back, you don't reply, and if you do that, I'll harm you again. That is some way of making me carry out on my threat. The third thing you need for that is some way of protecting weak people. That if I don't have the resources to, which in the past means basically people who fight for me, to harm you, how do I get my rights protected? And the fourth thing you need is a way of terminating feud, a way of making sure that if you're in a situation where I think you've wronged me and you think you haven't, and you therefore refuse to pay me, and when I injure you, you injure me in retaliation, it doesn't go back and forth. So you need some way of terminating that kind of a chain. Real legal systems in the past have shown solutions to all of those problems. In the system of this sort that I first came across was Saga period Iceland. Iceland was settled starting about 870 by Norsemen. They set up a rather interesting legal system, which I could give another talk about. But the part that matters here is that it was a system in which there were courts, but no government law enforcement. So there was a single court system, but once you got your verdict, it was up to you to enforce it. And what made it possible to enforce it was that if you had been, if the court had ruled that you owed me damage payment and you refused to pay it, I go back to the court and have you outlawed. It is legal to kill an outlaw. It is illegal to defend an outlaw. So if your friends try to fight my friends, every time anybody on my side gets hurt, there's another law case against the people on your side. Whereas if your people get hurt, that's tough luck. They're breaking the law. So that was one such system that we happen to know about. more generally, you need some mechanism so that all of the interested third parties in the society, the people around you, will recognize whether what you're doing is in fact law enforcement or extortion. And the court system is one way of doing that. In a small enough society, there's a feud system currently running in England among the Romanchal, the largest Romani group in England. And that's one in which if I believe you've wronged me, I threaten to beat you up if you don't compensate me. And both of us know that in this society, it's a small enough society so the people around will know whether in fact you've wronged me or not. Larger society needs something more organized than that. Somalia, which is a sort of Icelandic system that only terminated about 50 years ago when the state of Somalia was created by England and Italy, which had been very loosely, more or less, in charge of what had been a mostly stateless society. In Somalia, you had mechanisms for creating a court that would be recognized for any dispute, and then the verdict of that court would be accepted. So there are a variety of ways in which that problem can be solved. Next problem is commitment mechanisms. How do we make sure that my threat is really believable, that I won't just back down when you say, if you try to get me, I'll get you? One way is sort of hardwired into us. People sometimes talk as though property was a modern invention, but in fact, property predates our species. In other species, we call it territorial behavior. There are a variety of species, mostly, I think, birds and fish, which have the same basic pattern, which is an individual marks some territory it is claiming. And it then, as it were, turns a switch in its brain such that if another member of its species and gender comes onto that territory, it will fight. And will fight more and more desperately the farther into the territory the trespasser comes. A fight to the death is usually a loss for both sides. So unless the trespasser is much stronger, once it is clear that the defender is actually committed, the trespasser usually backs down. So that's a form of property. It's a very primitive form of property. There's no way of buying or selling it, but it is a way in which you have enforceable property rights enforced by a commitment strategy, not by a state, which predates our species. The human version of that, I can observe in myself. If I bump my head, my first reaction is rage. My first reaction is somebody has attacked me, I've got to get him. Hardwired pattern in human beings, which I think all of us have observed. It makes no sense in that case. The only person who's injured me is me if I've bumped my head against something. But nonetheless, it's the way we react. And human beings are, in fact, as it were, programmed so that when somebody injures you, you feel a strong desire to get back at him. But there are other ways in which we enforce the commitment strategy. If I threaten to get you if you don't compensate me and I back down, I've now marked myself as a safe target, as somebody who can be stolen from or trespassed on or whatever the issue is without cost. And what I want is the reputation of somebody who is not a safe target, somebody who, if you violate my rights, I will act against you. Status. Human beings care a whole lot about status, and nobody wants to be seen as a wimp. One of the hard parts of the problem is that we need a commitment strategy which lasts past death, because otherwise the obvious counter move for the person who I'm threatening is to say, all right, if you're going to get me, I'll kill you first. And the Icelandic solution to that problem was that I get a claim against you if you kill me, and my kin inherit that claim. My kin also inherit the claim that I was suing you for in the first place. So that means that my relatives have an incentive to carry out my threat, even if I'm no longer around to do so. Next problem is, how do you protect the weak? And my favorite solution to that is the Icelandic solution. It's the reason that I claim that the American legal system is a mere 1,000 years behind the cutting edge of legal technology. because in Icelandic law, tort claims were marketable, transferable. So I'm an elderly man with one son, and somebody kills him. And I now have a claim for several hundred ounces of silver for damage payments for killing my son. All right, there is no criminal law in our sense because there's no state enforcing it. It's all, as it were, tort law. But I know that if I try to go to the court and enforce that, I'm going to get beaten up on the way because I've got nobody who will fight for me. My neighbor, however, has 4 strong sons who went a Viking in their youth and lots of friends and relatives and allies. So I transfer my claim to him. He collects the claim, and if I'm lucky, pays me back half of the silver that he's collected. But even if he doesn't pay me back anything, the critical point is that it means that somebody who kills my son will have to pay a weregeld, a several hundred ounce fine for doing so. And therefore, my rights, the rights of my son, are being protected by deterrence, whether or not I actually get the compensation. And whether I get the compensation is probably going to depend on how hard it is for my neighbor to collect the money. Next, Somalia had a somewhat different system. In Somalia, you had what they sometimes refer to as the dia paying group, which is a set of people, usually relatives, but not necessarily relatives, who had made an agreement, a contract, in which if any of them got injured, the others would help him recover the damage payment. And if any of them, and I should say the other members would get a share of the damage payment in exchange. So that was a way in which if you were a member of that group, you had other people who would fight for you. It's a pre-existing coalition, as it were. The final problem is terminating feud, where I think I wronged you and you think I didn't. You demand compensation. I refuse. You harm me, and now I demand compensation. You refuse. How do we stop that? One solution in both Iceland and Somalia, about 1,000 years apart, is to have a court. So we say, all right, we'll take this to the court that other people, our neighbors, respect. And if the court rules in my favor, well, you'll say, I guess I'm not a wimp for paying because I lost the case. And the other way, if it rules in your favor. The other solution that you see in the Icelandic sagas is an arbitrator. You find some individual who is both powerful and respected, and who will agree to rule on your dispute. Both sides agree to do that because each side believes he's in the right. If he rules in favor of you, first, I now have a good excuse for giving up because a neutral party has ruled for you. And second, if I don't give up, he's now added to your alliance, and he's a powerful individual, and therefore that will make it harder for me to win. So those are all ways in which real societies have, in fact, privately enforced law. This doesn't tell us this is better than the modern system. I don't want to make strong claims. What this tells us is that it is possible for private institutions to replace government in its most central function, which is law enforcement. And let me now go to the present. There is a county, Shasta County in California, a couple of hours from where I live, which has private law. Robert Ellickson, who's a Yale professor, got interested in it for various reasons I'm not going to go into because that would be a different talk, and concluded that there was a system of privately enforced norms, which in some contexts trumped the law of California. Because one of the norms were norms of neighborly behavior. And if you let your cattle stray onto my field and trample and eat my vegetables, if you were a good neighbor, once you realized that, you would volunteer to help me replant the field. If you didn't do that, I would tell everybody about it, and your wife would stop being invited to bridge parties, and your kids might have a harder time finding playmates. And if you're really tough and maybe you don't have a wife and kids and you don't care what anybody thinks about you, eventually the third time your cattle strayed onto my field, I would open the gate, drive your cattle a few miles in the direction away from your farm, and then leave them for you to find and recover. So that, and what I find neat about that is that it is legitimate in that system of norms for me to make it hard for you to find your cattle. It is not legitimate for me to convert one of your cattle into hamburger. All right, that would be this is a rural area. I presumably am capable of butchering animals. That would seem like a much more attractive punishment from my standpoint, because I end up getting a cow's worth of beef. But the trouble is that if I profit by enforcing it, I cannot be trusted to only do it when my rights are really violated. That's one of the problems with our legal system. I'm not sure it's a soluble problem, that on the one hand, it's a nice thing to say, if you violated my rights, I can make you pay me money. But that also means that it pays me to sue you, even when you're not guilty, if I have a reasonable hope of persuading a court that you are. So that's one example of a legal system, a private legal system. We don't call it law, we call it norms, but it in fact has all of the characteristics of a legal system, that you do something that violates the rules and somebody punishes you. And Ellickson went through a number of cases where the legal solution to a particular problem existed in the law of California, but was not enforced. And it wasn't enforced because one of the norms of neighborly behavior is that neighbors don't sue neighbors. So the cost of using the court system was higher than the benefit from the standpoint of those people. A number of other things that exist of this sort. One of them, which does not exist yet, but might in the near future, is my son Patri's project of seasteading. And the basic idea there is to develop a technology for floating housing, basically big rafts. And what do you do with that? You tow a bunch of rafts together and you have a village. That village, if it's outside the territorial waters of any country, can make its own law. If it's inside the territorial waters, it can get different countries that would like to get a payoff from it to compete for letting it make its own law. It'll probably have to pay something in that case. But in either case, you have a situation with competitive government. In my first book, written long before Patri was conceived, I sketched what the world would be like if people were perfectly mobile. And I imagined that the newspapers say there's going to be a war between France and England, and the next day the sun rises on an empty landscape. Nobody's living there anymore because everybody's moved to safer places. All there are a few war reporters and a few generals. And Patri, in effect, is arguing you could get that effect if people are mobile and can take their houses with them, as it were. Because now, if your village makes some laws you don't like, call up a tugboat company, they tug your raft out of that village, you find some other people who agree with you about what the law should be, get theirs together. So it's a very neat idea. That is, Patri's underlying point was that what we need to argue about is not what the law should be, but what mechanisms will generate good law. And he was then proposing a technology that would do it. A version of this, which is actually happening, but a less extreme version, are charter cities, where entrepreneurs persuade the government of some relatively poor country to give them control over a not very valuable to that country piece of territory, and let them set at least the civil law in that territory. And you then have, as it were, a pocket of American, British, common law, whatever it is, law in some place like Venezuela. And if it works, that attracts people who'd like to live there, who'd like to start businesses and so forth. And in a way, the model for this was oddly enough produced by communist China, because one of the major steps in the transition of China from actually being socialist to pretending to be socialist, which has been its status for the last 20 or 30 years now, was the creation of territories within which you were allowed to be capitalist. And the original theory, as far as I can tell, was that clearly the capitalists know something we don't. Because after all, after Mao died, the communist leaders were able to go abroad. And what did they discover? They discovered that their country, which they believed had the best economic system in the world, was dirt poor. I think vice chairman or something of China went to England, discovered that a trash collector in England had twice his income, and reported that England would be the perfect communist economy if only it had a communist party running it. And so what did they do? One of the things they did is say, well, look, how can we figure out what the secrets of the capitalists are? Let's have little isolated capitalist enclaves. And in those enclaves, you can make deals with foreign companies, you can trade, you can do all of these evil capitalist things. We'll put them in places that don't matter. One of the places that didn't matter is a village which I think now has 6 million people. And eventually the exception swallowed the rule. It became clear this was working. And in, I think, 20 years after Mao's death, per capita income of China went up about 20-fold. Very striking case. Unfortunately, the person responsible for that is no longer alive, and his successors don't have as clear an idea of how to make China a good place. But you have common law zones in the United Arab Emirates, in Kazakhstan. You've got the Prospera in Honduras, and all of these are attempts, at least, to create, as it were, little mini Hong Kongs, as it were, mini areas within which you have something closer to a free market system because it works better. And of course, the difficulty with all of this is how do you prevent the government from saying, great, you've built all sorts of nice stuff, now we'll steal it. And that's currently litigation going on in Honduras over Prospera. But there's a different sense in which you have private law in the modern system, and that is that you have states competing with each other on corporate law. That there's a reason why most corporations are chartered in Delaware, because that means that their disputes will get settled under Delaware law. Delaware collects money for doing that. And that means that there is, as it were, a competing market of states to attract people to sign their contracts in those states. I should say in medieval Islam, you had something somewhat similar because there are 4 different schools of Sunni law. And if you signed your contract in the court of in a Maliki court, that meant that it would be interpreted under Maliki law. So you had a certain element of multiple legal systems within a single society in traditional medieval Islamic society, more or less ended by the Ottoman Empire. In a sense, if you think about all of this, if migration is easy enough, governments are only landlords, right? If governments have to make the rules that people want to live under, and all they have is physical control of the land, which is certainly worth something. They can collect revenue from that, but not all that much. You might imagine a world which gradually transitions from states to anarchy without anybody ever noticing when it happens. If for those of you who read science fiction, Snow Crash is a fictional version of that, where you have, in fact, an anarchist society, but there are still people who think they're part of the government. They just aren't doing anything. Let me go on to what I guess is my favorite version of modern anarchy that is gradually happening, and that's anarchy in cyberspace. I don't know how many of you know much about public key encryption, but the technology has been known for quite a while by which it is practical for an individual to transmit messages to another individual which no third party can read. It is practical to some extent. We're not as good at that as we ought to be yet, to make payments that no third party can observe. And there are mechanisms by which you can have contract enforcement using reputation, because what you can do is I sign a contract with you online. We agree on an arbitrator. Each of us digitally sign a contract, which is basically our identity online is defined by a public key and a private key. We only have the private key. Everybody in the world has the public key, and you can use the public key to encrypt messages that I can read. And you can also use it to check my digital signature, which shows that I wrote a message. That would be a different talk, so I'm not going to go into the details of the technology. But basically, for online transactions, it is currently technologically practical for them to be entirely private. And there are mechanisms, some of which are currently in use, by which you can enforce contracts. I guess the most widely used one is the way eBay works, that when you make a transaction with eBay, you get to report to the eBay and everybody else who's interested on whether or not the other party actually did what he said he would do. And anybody who wants to deal with that party then can check on whether it's got a 99% positive rate. And if it doesn't, you don't deal with it. So there are various ways the technology can be used to leverage reputational enforcement. That could be another talk as well, which I'm not giving this time. But now I should say there are disadvantages to this system as well. In particular, once you have a fully private online system where everybody's got public key encryption, it is possible to have a criminal firm with brand name reputation. In my book, Future Imperfect, I sketch out my business plan for Murder Incorporated, which depends on the fact that you can use these technologies to arrange that any customer who wants can reach you without the FBI being able to read the communications. And you can use the technology to have somebody pay you, and you establish a reputation for killing people without having the usual problems of payoff and of various ways in which the law can get you. So this is a double-edged knife, as it were, but it can give you a system in which online transactions are in effect uncontrolled. That also means, of course, that they can't be taxed, because you can't tax something you can't observe. Let me now go on. I would argue that this is something which is gradually developing and not in as complete a form as I've imagined. And I want to go on to my original idea for how you could have a modern society in which law and law enforcement were entirely private. In this system, each individual is the customer of a rights enforcement agency, and you get to choose which rights enforcement agency it is. You get to switch if you want to. And the rights enforcement agency is selling you two services. One of them is protecting his rights, and the other is settling his disputes. And now the obvious problem that arises, as everybody points out in about 30 seconds after hearing this idea, is what happens when customers of two different rights enforcement agencies have a conflict. So I observe when I come home that my television set is missing. The video camera that my rights enforcement agency kindly installed in my living room shows you walking out the door with my television set. So my rights enforcement agency gets in touch with you and says, please return Mr. Friedman's television set, and would you mind paying us $20 for our time and trouble in retrieving it? And you, of course, say, I don't know Mr. Friedman. I don't know his television set. I've got a nice television set that a friend of mine gave me, and it's none of your business who the friend is. I got my own privacy. And my agency says, well, we're sorry you feel that way. If you're not willing to submit this to a court, 4 tough guys are going to show up at your door tomorrow morning to retrieve the television set. And you say, well, if that happens, I'll get in touch with my rights enforcement agency, and they'll send 6 tough guys to keep your 4 tough guys from stealing my television set. And that's a war between the two agencies. That's Ayn Rand's response to this and lots of other people. But it doesn't really make a whole lot of sense because wars are very expensive and these are profit-making businesses. So it makes a whole lot more sense if you have two rights enforcement agencies who know that their customers will sometimes have conflicts, for them to agree in advance on a private court whose verdicts they will accept. And having done that, they can then settle it by saying, if the court rules against our customer, we won't protect him because we don't believe in protecting stolen television sets. And if the court rules customer, you agree to pay him a small damage payment for the time and trouble you put him to by falsely accusing him of stealing a television set. Now, the question that ought to occur to you is, what enforces this contract? We've got a contract between the agencies agreeing to abide by a court decision. But in this world, there's no government. So there is no power over them that can force them to abide by their contract. What there is, however, is the discipline of constant dealings, the fact that they're repeat players. So each of the enforcement agency knows that if it refuses to go along when its customer loses the case, then the other one will refuse to go along when its customer loses. Then they're back to fighting. And at that point, they're going to lose their customers to some competing agency which believes in arbitration instead of war, because war is very expensive. And most customers don't really want to have their front lawn turned into a free fire zone. So this is a mechanism which gives you law enforcement, peaceful law enforcement without a government. And now the next question, which I've really slid over in the earlier cases, is where do the laws come from? What determines what laws exist in this system? And the answer is that the arbitration agency is selling its services to the rights enforcement agency. The rights enforcement agency is selling to its customers a package which includes the laws of the arbitration agencies that it uses. So the rights enforcement agency is going to be asking itself, how much more can we get if the arbitration agency has this legal rule instead of that legal rule? The arbitration agency is going to be asking itself, how much more can we sell our arbitration services for, according to which legal rule we have? So I like to imagine a case where the customers of one arbitration agency, maybe they're from around here, are all pacifists who disapprove of capital punishment. And the customers of another from perhaps a different part of Arizona are people who want to make damn sure that if anybody kills them, he gets hanged. And they happen to have they wouldn't necessarily have different rights enforcement agencies, but they could. And so what happens, each agency does a little market research. And the local agency finds that if they can guarantee that if in disputes with the people in Tucson, their customers don't have to accept a capital punishment rule, they can make an extra $1 million a year in the value to their customers of having that rule. And the people in Tucson discover they can only make $500,000 by getting the rule that way. So your agency agrees to give the Tucson agency something else they want, maybe money or agreement on some other disputes. Tucson agency is going to care a whole lot about rules for protecting gem shows, because Tucson, as you may know, has the world's largest gem show every February. Whatever the rules are, it pays them to bargain to the set of rules that maximize the welfare of the customers, as reflected by what they're willing to pay for being under those rules. So that means you have to have a market mechanism for generating law. And I've been arguing for a long time that one of the advantages of anarcho-capitalism over minarchy, over the libertarian idea of having a small government which does do law enforcement and makes laws, is that we don't have any mechanism for making governments make good laws, as we can observe by the current situation. But what I have is a mechanism for making it in the interest of the people who are making laws, who are now private firms on a competitive market, to make good laws. And that's from my standpoint, the basic argument for the superiority of the system that I'm recommending. And I gather I'm running low on time. 5 minutes, yeah. But I'd like to have some time for questions. So instead of going on through other stuff I was thinking of talking about, which includes, I should say, various things wrong with this system. I spend several chapters of the third edition of my book, The Machinery of Freedom, discussing ways in which a system might break down and under what circumstances it's likely to break down, and ways in which the legal rules that generated would not be perfect, because markets don't actually work perfectly. They're just better than the alternatives, and so forth. But I think I'd like to have a little time for questions.
Hi, this is Etienne de la Boissy from the Art of Liberty Foundation. If you liked this presentation from the 2024 Liberty on the Rocks conference in Sedona, then you are going to love the Art of Liberty Foundation's upcoming book, Voluntarism: How the Only Ism, Fair for Everyone, Leads to Harmony, Prosperity, and Good Karma for All. The book is in the same image and meme-rich format of Government, the Biggest Scam in History Exposed, featuring the executive summary of the executive summary to rapidly understand the important issues. If you or anyone you know has any doubt that the free market could provide all the legitimate, non-redistributive services provided by government better, faster, and cheaper without the waste, fraud, abuse, and extortion, then this is the book for you. You can pre-order a copy of the book through our $25,000 Indiegogo campaign to launch the book and get it into wide distribution at voluntarism-book.org.